Hey, it's Jordan with TYT Politics. I'm here with Tangerine Bolen with Revolution Truth, and we have a bit of exclusive news. You, along with others, are filing a lawsuit today in conjunction to the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the suit actually is, in addition to the oil company, you're suing the president. So, from the beginning, what's the arguments? What's the case based on? And how soon do you ask for a hearing?
Yes. So today we are filing on behalf of 10 plaintiffs from 4 tribes. And we are indeed suing President Trump. We're also suing the Army Corps of Engineers and, of course, Energy Transfer Partners for an immediate stop to this pipeline. It poses a grave risk to the water supply, to the water that is sacred to multiple tribes. This is a profound interference in their religious freedom. This is a clear case of environmental injustice and racial discrimination due to the arbitrary rerouting of this pipeline, or not so arbitrary. And our plaintiffs are coming forward in court to tell the world that, to stop the pipeline once and for all.
So, Standing Rock Sioux still has the overall lawsuit against the Army Corps of Engineers. What's the differentiating point for your with 10 plaintiffs? So obviously you have quite a bit of plaintiffs, but what's the difference between Standing Rock Sioux and what you guys are suing based on?
Right. So Standing Rock Sioux and Cheyenne River Sioux filed together a couple weeks ago, as you know. We are enjoining their case, so we're actually filing a claim in support of what they are already claiming, which is on religious freedom grounds, and also that the environmental impact study, needed to be completed. So we are, of course, in agreement with that. So we're adding a few things. We're bolstering both of those arguments. For one thing, as you now know, as we all now know, the Department of Interior issued a report basically siding with the tribe, saying that there are too many critical questions that remain unanswered. And one of those, of course, is the grave risk that this pipeline realistically poses. Empirically speaking, it poses a very serious risk to this water source. The other is these unanswered questions around religious freedom and religious rights, which are constitutional rights. So we are really bolstering these claims by adding our own on the constitutional rights and liberties front, and again, supporting the environmental issue. And we are bringing forward multiple experts on the environmental front about the construction of this pipeline and really how profoundly reckless this construction has been. Of course, in the last couple of weeks what's happened. It does pose a serious risk, and we're prepared to talk about that in court. So, we have, one more differentiating point. It's not the tribal governments themselves, but 10 individual plaintiffs who are speaking, on behalf of themselves, but also really more members of their tribe, not as their tribal governments. These are regular people from really all walks of life, but who face one commonality, which is this profoundly abusive and reckless process that Energy Transfer Partners has engaged in, endangering them, their loved ones, their communities for generations to come, if this proceeds.
And I'm assuming many of the plaintiffs are Native Americans.
Oh, yeah, they're all Native Americans,
Okay.
yes. From Standing Rock Sioux, Cheyenne River Sioux, Pine Ridge Lakota, and Oglala.
And so we have, from what you just described, you have the environmental sub case. You have
Yeah.
the religious rights case. You had mentioned the racial component. What are you arguing in terms of race?
Right. So, as we all know, these populations are historically marginalized. They're historically marginalized. They're highly vulnerable. They face very high levels of intergenerational trauma, really as a result of what our own government has done to them for a couple hundred years. They face many, many generations of having their sovereign rights and powers arbitrarily diminished by Congress. That has always been illegal. But thus far, the tribes across the country have had a really hard time abating that continual erosion of their sovereign rights. I don't know if your listeners already know this, but our indigenous people, the people of the Native American tribes of this country, live in a state of what's called dual sovereignty. And so they're are also citizens of their own tribal nations. This confers special rights and privileges upon them that we as a nation do not have the right to arbitrarily and steadily diminish as we have done. So we're actually approaching this in a slightly different fashion from the standpoint of their dual citizenship. And sorry, so I know that was a bit of a tangent, but essentially going back to the racial discrimination issue, the route that was originally planned, there were 3 routes, and one of them was outside of North Bismarck, which is predominantly white. That pipeline route was rejected in favor of the route going under Lake Oahe. Well, you can't even compare the social variables of those two populations. The Native American populations versus predominantly white Bismarck, the Native American populations are highly vulnerable and are facing extreme levels of poverty and other compounded issues. So in comparison, I mean, there just isn't any comparison. And it's a clear case of racial discrimination. These people cannot afford the impact of this pipeline and the dangers that it poses. So, yeah.
Well, what I also find interesting, it just came out that the former Department of Interior solicitor under President Obama had written a memo, I think it was like 35 pages, basically saying what you just said, that vehemently against the fact that this was rerouted, but the Army Corps rerouted it from north of Bismarck, predominantly white, to this area. But lost in all that, the racial component, but just by the facts, the Army Corps' rationale for rerouting it was there's just a lot more people north of Bismarck, there's a lot more water wells, all this. However, the rerouting to they say Lake Oahe, but basically the Missouri River, there's 18 million people downstream that get this. So on the facts, the whole rerouting from Bismarck doesn't really make sense because there's just as many people affected by putting it under Lake Oahe.
Precisely, Jordan. And actually, again, you can't even make comparisons between the 2 routes. There were a few minor to moderate technical issues with the North Bismarck route, but those, according to our experts, could have been solved. And there are other alternate routes that could have been chosen that wouldn't place this profound disproportionate impact upon these vulnerable populations. So there was no excuse for Energy Transfer Partners to choose and the Army Corps to allow for the Lake Oahe route. According to our experts, and they hail from around the world, they work in the pipeline industry. They construct these pipelines for a living as engineers. They're water specialists, water pollution specialists. So according to all of them, this pipeline route poses by far the gravest risk. And it's not an if it leaks, it is a when. And there's no way to clean it up. There's no way to fix it when that slow, steady leak occurs. And at the rate that we think that they're constructing the pipeline under Lake Oahe, it's even more reckless and more dangerous. The whole situation, frankly, Jordan, as you know, it's quite shocking. And our plaintiffs need their day in court to stop the pipeline.
Now, obviously, the mainstream media only cares about anything that has to do with Donald Trump. It's unfortunate. His tweets, any word is 24/7 breaking news. So, why is President Trump added on to this? What is your case alleging he did wrong?
Right. So he is actually engaging in a clear abuse of his powers. There is still a separation of powers in the United States government, and we do obviously have 3 branches of government. Donald Trump does not have the right to make law. He has just overstepped his bounds by directing the Army Corps to essentially grant this easement when the Army Corps itself had issued a statement saying that these questions, the environmental questions, the environmental racism questions needed to be answered. The Department of Interior, as you know, issued that 37-page report indicating the same. And so President Trump doesn't have the right to direct an independent agency to do something other than what it has already decided, not in the manner in which he did. So we are going to try to stop him on that front.
Not to cut you off, but devil's advocate, couldn't he and his army of advisors say he didn't direct them to stop it. Or to grant it. He directed them to expeditiously review and make a decision one way or the other. I'm not. I know he didn't do that, but I'm saying, couldn't that be their argument?
I know you're going to talk to Bruce Afrin, our lead counsel, soon, so I think that he can really expound upon that. But what I can say is this, that they didn't complete that review. So, and also the second part of that is they broke a procedural rule, which is a very clear rule for us, which is that the Army Corps issued a public statement granting the public a 20-day comment period. They asked for robust commentary and discussion on the completion of this pipeline. Then they did arbitrarily cut off that comment period. Well, that's against the law. The public had the right to weigh in. This is a democracy. We were asked to weigh in, and then we were denied that right. So we're suing to stop that, essentially.
Right. And there's been a lot of critique, I would say, of some of the lawsuits that went forward that didn't make treaty rights as the front and center argument. I kind of see it both ways, because I know even though morally the treaty rights should be at the front, obviously the legal system in America over the last couple hundred years has not really granted in favor of Native Americans based on treaty rights. Is treaty rights involved in your lawsuit?
It is, but it is in a more subtle fashion. And I do agree with you. I think in that regard, we're sort of moderate and perhaps a little bit more strategic. In this case, it may be a benefit that we're outsiders the way that we are, that our legal counsel, our legal team doesn't have, decades of work in tribal law. There is a boon to that. And that is that we may think on it a little bit differently. And so we're approaching this in a subtle fashion. And essentially, that harkens back to what I mentioned earlier. Our plaintiffs are dual citizens. As U.S. citizens, they have a right to the protections and rights conferred by the United States Constitution. They have a right to be protected from those being assaulted. As citizens of their sovereign tribal nations, they don't recognize the authority of the United States government, the authority of the United States court system, and certainly not the authority of energy transfer partners to trample their rights, their sovereign rights and powers. And so we're engaging this battle from that perspective, really a more subtle recognition on the record, the public record in the court of law, that these are sovereign citizens and they have distinct rights under that dual citizenship.
So here's a twofold question. As I reported yesterday, it pretty much looks like Energy Transfer Partners was either drilling when they did not have a permit to drill, or have recklessly drilled under this lake at a Herculean pace that is very dangerous. It came out that they have filed in court this week that they are done drilling under Lake Oahe. However, on February 8th, they publicly said it's going to take around 60 days to drill under the lake. Well, that would mean if they filed this week, roughly they were done drilling 17 days later. So is there anything in this case about challenging that they might have done something illegal there, or is that you just didn't have time for that and that might come up later?
The latter. We didn't have time for that. Obviously, we're in quite the crunch here in this David and Goliath situation as we file in the 12th hour. However, that is not lost on us, and we really appreciate your reporting on that. We will be bringing that up later, and it may happen that we file for an emergency injunction to stop the oil after it has started flowing, which is, tragic as far as our plaintiffs go, but we will do everything in our power to stop this from actually flowing under Lake Oahe, going forward. And yes, that situation is certainly worthy of deeper exploration. And the moment we can come up for air, we will be addressing it.
So last question, I want to get into your experts, because you mentioned you have experts on the water, on the environment. Do you have pipeline industry experts that could speak to the construction of pipelines, whether laws were broken, whether it was reckless, those things?
Do you mean in court or on interviews?
Court.
Yes. Yes, we do.
Okay. And lastly, just logistically, like I just said, the company is giving a range between March 6th and April 1st that the pipeline will be up and running. Obviously, common sense, it's probably closer to March 6th because these people only care about money. Their investors have a gun to their head. So if you're filing today, what is the game plan? Are you asking for an immediate injunction to stop the pipeline? When reasonably will there be a hearing?
Well, we have to wait and see what happens in the court hearing on Monday with the Cheyenne River and Standing Rock Sioux case. Since we are enjoining that case, we'll see what the judge says. If the judge rules against them, and we hope that that doesn't happen, we still have, again, those additional claims that we're filing. So no matter what, we will be heard in court. But of course, we don't set the court hearing dates. So I can't say too much about how this will play out. What I can say is that the battle is far from over. Standing Rock is not over. We have brought this battle from Standing Rock itself to the courts. And we really want people to join us and support RevolutionTruth.org because we crowdsource justice and we need the public's help to fundraise, to pay for our experts, to pay for the cost of the case. This is an all-volunteer effort. So it's not over, and we really hope that the world joins us to defeat DAPL in D.C.
And just so people know, I should have mentioned it at the top, but just for your credibility purposes, can you explain as quickly as you can? You obviously were involved in a pretty nationally known lawsuit a few years ago.
I was, yeah. So my group instigated a multi-plaintiff lawsuit, unfortunately, against President Obama in 2012 and the National Defense Authorization Act when he signed a provision into law that granted the rights of and powers of indefinite detention over any citizen anywhere, including U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. We sued to challenge that, and my co-plaintiffs, I was a plaintiff, our organization was a plaintiff. Our co-plaintiffs included former New York Times journalist Chris Hedges and famous whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers, of course, the illustrious Dr. Noam Chomsky and others. And so we sued. We won handily in court in the first round in a 150-page ruling, the judge excoriating Obama and the U.S. government for what they've done, and unfortunately lost in the Second Circuit. And so Trump now has those powers to indefinitely detain people based on secret evidence. So unconstitutional, but we're still here. We're still going. And though we're small and all volunteer, we're pretty scrappy and determined, and we will keep working on restoring our rights, just like you and everyone else who's properly, adequately, finally covering the news as it should be covered. So we thank you for that, Jordan.
And just to button this up, as a reminder, we have 10 plaintiffs, 4 different tribes, Energy Transfer Partners, Army Corps, and President Trump are being sued. I got that right?
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for breaking this with us, and we'll be talking again.
Thank you so much, Jordan.
Have a good one.